Move to change the constitution to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa has assured people that the policy will be implemented in a manner that will not cripple the country or destabilize the agricultural sector. Theo Boshoff, Wandile Sihlobo and Sfiso Ntombela have authored a discussion paper on the compensation debate. Boshoff from Agribiz joins me now live from our Pretoria studios. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. When this decision was announced, there was an emphasis on the fact that it should not harm other sectors, particularly the economy. Is it possible to have expropriation without compensation and leave the economy untouched by this?
It's a very good question, and I think that's one of the questions that all the stakeholders currently are trying to figure out and trying to formulate some sort of idea of what that situation could look like. As you correctly mentioned, that the ANC did mention that it should take place without harming the economy, the financial sector, and of course the agricultural sector. So what my colleagues and I have done is we tried to look at the various scenarios that could take place. How exactly could this take place in a manner that it wouldn't harm the economy? Looking at a scenario-based approach. So the worst case scenario, of course, if it does descend into almost a self-help type of scenario where the rule of law is collapsed and everyone identifies land for themselves and land occupation takes place. I think from both a legal and economical point of view, that would be quite bad. There could, of course, be another scenario where it takes place, as has currently been the case, almost a business as usual approach, where the emphasis is largely placed on maintaining economic integrity and of the land market, as well as economic sustainability. That scenario, however, might not necessarily satisfy those seeking accelerated land redistribution. So there's these two almost competing interests. It will be very interesting to see how they can somehow be reconciled.
What factors do you think will play a part in deciding which scenario is most likely to play out?
I think definitely the time that's taken until this decision is defined in greater detail will certainly play a role. As we know currently, that the decision has been announced in very broad terms, but we don't have a clear indication of timeframes or what amendments could possibly take place to the Constitution, as well as what safeguards are put in place to try and ensure economic sustainability. The risk, of course, is that the longer that this remains undefined, the more there is the opportunity for people to interpret it and take it into their own hands, if I can put it that way. So I think that would certainly be one factor that could be taken into consideration, is the time, as well as other factors. We know there's a variety of other government policies, the National Development Plan that talks about maintaining the integrity of the land market and business confidence. So the key will be to see how much weight is placed onto those factors, the economic factors, versus trying to satisfy or appease, if I can put it in that way, those seeking or those pushing for expropriation without compensation. A last thing I think that we also perhaps shouldn't lose sight of is that the Constitution does currently, in its form without amendment, allow for expropriation to take place, but subject to just and equitable compensation. Now, this just and equitable principle the courts haven't really had a chance to interpret it meaningfully and to give content to it. So at this moment of time, we know that there's a variety of factors that could be taken into consideration, but we don't currently know exactly what just and equitable compensation could mean. So I think in terms of when we're talking about an amendment to the Constitution, perhaps something that is worth exploring as well is to see what just and equitable compensation could mean in these given circumstances, such as land reform, where the public interest could play quite a leading role in calculating the amount of compensation.
On the one hand, we've got agriculture, which contributes between 2 and 7% to GDP, which could be harmed if this process isn't carried out properly, so people have to be very aware of that. On the other hand, people say that Black South Africans were dispossessed of land through many mechanisms, including the Native Land Act of 1913, which led to the poverty and inequality that we still see today. So a legal mechanism has deprived people of arable land. In a constitutional democracy, why is the reversal of this seen as such a tricky and financial economic issue?
I think perhaps just from the outset it might be worth stating that transformation in the sector is absolutely vital. So land reform as a principle is something that I think is almost universally supported, and it's contained in the Constitution. So it's all about how that takes place and trying to find mechanisms how that can take place without harming the agricultural sector. And now we know that there's been this, the proposal of amending the Constitution has been placed on the table, but there's a variety of other things that haven't been tested yet. I mentioned earlier expropriating in terms of the current provisions to try and see what just and equitable compensation is. There's also market-driven mechanisms that could be pursued to unlock vast capital to try and increase the capital available to try and acquire land. I know ourselves with the Banking Association of South Africa, we compiled a hybrid, or we drafted a hybrid financing mechanism whereby the state, through interest subsidies and possible default guarantees to a limited extent, could assist or make a lot of land reform beneficiaries bankable. So in other words, almost a soft loan approach whereby the private financial institutions can actually finance land acquisition. And I think in this way, the primary cause, or it seems to be that the root cause of the need, or at least the desire to amend the Constitution, is that the land reform is wholly under budgeted for. I mean, currently, you mentioned the agricultural sector is between 2 and 7%. I think with a secondary processing sector, it probably accounts for closer to about 16% of the economy, which is very substantial. But currently, land reform only makes up about 0.4% of the national budget. Now, I understand the fiscus is under strain, but if you can unlock mechanisms to try and get the private sector involved in financing it, through soft loans, as I mentioned, there's certainly a lot more scope to drastically increase and accelerate the pace of land redistribution without negatively affecting the sector and the reliance that especially the financial sector places in property rights as a means to finance the agricultural sector.
Theo Boshoff, one of the co-authors of a discussion paper on land expropriation without compensation. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. It's time for a short break. When we come back, a look at international business stories. Do stay with us.
Today on Rights and Recourse, we will unpack the new traditional court model.
The idea of the bill is not to overregulate, to basically set the principles.
The most important aspect of this bill is that it understands that customary law by its nature is consensual, that I have a right to affiliate, I have a right therefore to opt in, and I have a right to opt out.
The opt-out provision is basically one that you've got to respect the court in the sense of, if you've been summoned, you've got to tell the clerk of the court at least that you're not willing to attend.
The challenge that I would like to throw to the Department of Justice, it has to come up with mechanisms of ensuring that people who exercise their right to opt out or to opt in are not in any way victimized.
Hashtag Rights with Dumila Matez on legal issues every Sunday at 2 o'clock Central African Time.
The Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, says sharp swings in global financial markets in the past